Dr. Sarah Chen stepped off the transport shuttle onto the metal deck of Research Station Omega-7, her breath forming small clouds in the recycled air. The station floated in the outer rim of human space, far from the warm planets where children played in gardens and families gathered for dinner. Here, in the cold darkness between stars, the Galactic Council conducted experiments that most civilized worlds preferred not to know about. Dr. Chen, welcome aboard. Administrator Vex approached her with the mechanical precision that marked all Zenthari officials. His gray skin had the texture of old leather, and his forearms moved in practiced coordination as he gestured toward the station's interior. I trust your journey from Earth was comfortable. Sarah adjusted the strap of her medical bag and followed him through corridors lined with containment cells. Each cell was marked with symbols she couldn't read, but the low growling and scratching sounds from within told her everything she needed to know. As comfortable as any journey to a black site research facility can be, I suppose. The Zenthari's laugh sounded like grinding metal. Your human sense of humor is noted in your file. The Council appreciates your expertise in xenobiology and trauma psychology. These subjects require special handling. They walked deeper into the station, past laboratories filled with equipment Sarah recognized, and others that made her stomach turn. Through reinforced windows, she glimpsed scientists of various species working with specimens that thrashed against restraints or lay motionless on examination tables. The smell of antiseptic couldn't quite mask the underlying sense of fear, and something else, something wild and predatory. Tell me about the subjects, Sarah said, keeping her voice steady and professional. She had worked with traumatized children before, both human and alien, but never in a setting like this. Vex consulted a data pad with two of his hands, while the other two opened a heavy security door. 4 specimens, designated subjects Alpha through Delta. They were acquired as infants from the Cathara homeworld during the pacification campaign. The Cathara, as you know, are apex predators, evolved hunters with enhanced strength, speed, and sensory capabilities that make them extremely dangerous to most galactic species. Sarah had read about the Cathara in the briefing materials during her 3-week journey to the station. A proud warrior race that had refused to submit to Council authority, they had been declared a threat to galactic peace. Their homeworld had been bombarded from orbit, their cities reduced to ash, their population scattered or enslaved. The official reports called it a necessary intervention. Sarah had other words for it. These 4 were selected from among several dozen captured infants, Vex continued, leading her through another corridor. They have been raised in isolation, trained as weapons from birth. The goal is to create controllable Cathara warriors, beings with all their species' natural advantages, but none of their cultural independence or rebellious nature. They stopped before a massive blast door marked with warning symbols in a dozen languages. Beyond it lay the containment area where her new patients waited. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she imagined what she would find: children raised as weapons, their natural development twisted by years of conditioning and isolation. What ages are they now? She asked. Approximately 12 to 14 years old by human standards. Their species matures slightly faster than yours. Vex input a long security code, and the blast door began to cycle open. They have been trained in combat, weapons handling, stealth, and assassination techniques. They are perfectly obedient to their handlers and show no emotional attachment to anyone or anything. The door finished opening, revealing a sterile white corridor with 4 cells along one wall. Each cell was more like a small barracks room containing a cot, a wash basin, and shelves lined with military equipment. The walls were transparent aluminum, allowing full observation of the occupants. Sarah approached the first cell and felt her breath catch in her throat. The creature inside could have been a human child at first glance, but only at first glance. He sat perfectly straight on his cot, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead with eyes that seemed to see everything and feel nothing. His hair was pure white, cut in a military buzz cut, and his skin had a faint silvery sheen. When he turned his head to look at her, she saw that his eyes were a startling gold color, with pupils that contracted to slits like a cat's. More than his appearance, though, it was his stillness that unsettled her. Real children fidgeted, moved, showed curiosity or boredom or any of 100 small emotions. This child sat like a statue, breathing so quietly she could barely see his chest move. Subject Alpha, Vex said with something like pride in his voice. Male, approximately 14 years old, highest aptitude scores in all combat disciplines. He can kill a full-grown Zenthari with his bare hands and shows no hesitation or emotional response to violence. Sarah moved to the second cell, where a slightly smaller figure sat in identical posture. This one was female, with the same white hair and golden eyes, but something in her expression seemed slightly more alive, a tiny spark of curiosity as she watched Sarah approach. Subject Beta, Vex continued his clinical presentation. Female, approximately 13 years old, exceptional skills in stealth and infiltration. She can move through a room without triggering motion sensors and has never failed an assassination exercise. The third cell held another male, this one with darker hair streaked with white. His eyes followed Sarah's movement with predatory focus, and she noticed his hands were slightly larger than a human child's hands should be, with fingernails that looked more like claws. Subject Gamma, male, approximately 13 years old, specialized in reconnaissance and tracking. He can identify individuals by scent from distances up to 2 kilometers and can track prey through any terrain. The fourth cell contained the smallest of the group, a girl who looked perhaps 12 years old. Like the others, she sat in perfect military posture, but Sarah caught something the administrator had missed: a tiny movement of her fingers, tracing patterns on her leg. It was so subtle that anyone not trained to look for signs of trauma might not notice it, but Sarah recognized it as a self-soothing behavior. Subject Delta, female, youngest of the group, excellent hand-to-hand combatant despite her size. She has particular talent for targeting pressure points and can disable opponents much larger than herself. Sarah stood back and looked at all 4 cells, at these children who had been turned into living weapons. They were magnificent and terrible at the same time, beautiful in the way that wild predators were beautiful, but completely empty of everything that made childhood precious. No laughter, no games, no wonder at the world around them. They had been efficiently stripped of their humanity, or rather, their Cathara nature, and rebuilt as tools. "What exactly is my role here?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The conditioning process has been largely successful," Vex replied, "but there have been some complications. Recently, the subjects have begun exhibiting behaviors that concern the research staff. Small acts of defiance, moments of emotional display, attempts at communication with each other. The Council fears that their natural Cathara instincts may be reasserting themselves." Sarah nodded slowly. "And you want me to eliminate those behaviors, to make the conditioning permanent?" "Precisely. Your expertise in trauma psychology and xenobiology makes you uniquely qualified to identify the source of these behavioral anomalies and develop treatment protocols to suppress them permanently." Treatment protocols. Sarah almost laughed at the clinical language used to describe the psychological torture of children, but she kept her expression neutral as she studied the 4 young Cathara. Alpha was staring straight ahead again, but Beta was still watching her with those golden eyes. Gamma had shifted slightly on his cot, turning his head to better track her scent, and Delta was still tracing those tiny patterns with her finger. "I'll need access to all their records," Sarah said finally. "Medical files, training reports, psychological evaluations, everything." "Of course, I'll have them transferred to your quarters immediately." Vex paused, studying her with his flat black eyes. "I should mention, Dr. Chen, that several previous psychologists have requested transfers from this assignment. Some found the work too challenging. The Council hopes your reputation for professional detachment will serve you better." Professional detachment. Sarah almost smiled. If only he knew how little professional detachment she actually possessed when it came to traumatized children. But she had gotten very good at hiding her emotions behind a mask of scientific curiosity. "I appreciate the confidence," she said. "When can I begin sessions with the subjects?" "Tomorrow morning. For now, let me show you to your quarters so you can review their files." Vex turned to lead her away from the cells, but Sarah lingered for a moment. Alpha was still staring straight ahead. Beta had returned to looking at the wall. Gamma was examining his hands with the precise attention of someone checking weapons. But Delta looked up and met Sarah's eyes directly for just a moment before quickly looking away. In that brief contact, Sarah saw something that made her chest ache with recognition. Fear. Not the learned fear of punishment that conditioned subjects showed, but the deep, primal fear of a child who knew she was trapped and alone and had no hope of rescue. Sarah followed Vex down the corridor, but she carried that look with her. In her quarters that night, as she read through files that detailed 12 years of systematic abuse disguised as training, she kept thinking about that moment of eye contact. The files were exactly what she had expected: cold, clinical documentation of how to break the spirit of a sentient being and rebuild them as a tool. The Cathara children had been separated from birth, never allowed to form attachments. They had been subjected to pain conditioning, isolation punishment, and constant surveillance. Their natural instincts for pack bonding and family structure had been deliberately suppressed through drugs and behavioral modification. But despite 12 years of this treatment, something in them was fighting back. The recent reports mentioned small infractions. Alpha had been caught sharing his food ration with Delta when she was placed in punishment isolation. Beta had been found attempting to teach the others a simple pattern game using pieces of torn cloth. Gamma had begun making soft vocalizations during rest periods that resembled Cathara lullabies, though he had never been exposed to Cathara culture. And Delta had started drawing, not with any materials provided to her, but scratching tiny pictures into the walls of her cell using her claws. Pictures of trees, stars, and small figures that might have been families. Sarah closed the last file and sat back in her chair. The station hummed quietly around her, filled with the sounds of machinery and distant conversations in a dozen alien languages. But she could feel the weight of those 4 cells somewhere below her, containing children who had never known kindness or love or safety. Tomorrow, she was supposed to begin the process of ensuring they never would know those things. Instead, as she prepared for bed, Sarah began planning something entirely different. She had come to this station believing she would help damaged children heal. Now she realized that these children weren't damaged. They were being deliberately broken, and her job was to complete that breaking. She couldn't heal them here, surrounded by guards and surveillance and the constant threat of the Council's displeasure. But maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to give them something else. Something their captors had tried to take away but had never quite succeeded in destroying. Sarah fell asleep that night thinking about golden eyes and small acts of rebellion, and for the first time in her career, she began planning to break every rule she had ever sworn to follow. The Predator pups had been built as weapons, but they were still children, and every child, no matter how they had been raised, deserved a chance to discover what family could mean, even if she had to teach them herself. Sarah stood outside Alpha's cell the next morning, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She had barely slept, spending most of the night reading psychological profiles and training reports that made her stomach turn. Now, in the harsh, artificial light of the containment area, she was about to begin the most important sessions of her career. Alpha sat in his usual position on the cot, spine straight, hands folded, staring at nothing. He hadn't acknowledged her presence, though she knew he was aware of every breath she took, every small movement she made. Cathara senses were far superior to human ones, and 12 years of survival training had honed his awareness to a razor's edge. "Good morning," Sarah said quietly, settling into a chair that had been placed outside his cell. The transparent aluminum barrier between them hummed almost inaudibly with energy. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm here to talk with you." Alpha's golden eyes shifted to look at her, but his expression remained perfectly blank. When he spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless, like a computer reading from a script. "This unit is designated Subject Alpha. This unit is ready to receive instructions or submit to examination." Sarah felt her heart break a little at the word unit. He had been so thoroughly conditioned that he didn't even refer to himself as a person. "I'd like to know what you prefer to be called. Do you have a name you like?" "This unit is designated Subject Alpha," he repeated with exact precision. There was no frustration in his voice, no sign that he understood the difference between a name and a designation. He had been trained to respond to questions about identity with a statement of function. "All right," Sarah said gently. "What do you remember about yesterday?" "Standard morning physical conditioning, weapons maintenance, combat simulation against holographic targets, evening meal, rest period." Alpha recited his schedule like a military report, his voice never changing tone. "No significant events to report." Sarah consulted her notes. According to the surveillance logs, Alpha had been caught placing his hand against the wall that separated his cell from Delta's during the evening rest period. When questioned, he had claimed to be checking the structural integrity of the barrier. The guards hadn't believed him, but they hadn't punished him either, since technically touching the wall wasn't against regulations. "Do you ever think about the other subjects?" Sarah asked carefully. Alpha's pupils contracted slightly, the first real reaction she had seen from him. For a moment, something flickered behind his golden eyes, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. This unit focuses on assigned tasks. Extraneous thoughts reduce combat efficiency. But you're aware of them, the others in the cells near yours. This unit is aware of all potential threats and allies in its environment. The answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. Sarah made a note that this was clearly a sensitive topic. She spent the next hour asking careful questions, mapping the boundaries of Alpha's conditioning. He could discuss combat techniques in detail, recite military protocols from memory, and analyze tactical situations with frightening precision. But when she asked about feelings, preferences, or personal experiences, he retreated into mechanical responses about unit efficiency and mission parameters. When the session ended, Alpha returned to staring at the wall as if she had never been there at all. Beta was different. As Sarah approached her cell, the girl was standing near the transparent barrier, watching her with obvious curiosity. Her posture was still military perfect, but there was something more alive in her expression. "Good morning," Sarah said, settling into her chair. "I'm Dr. Chen." "This unit is designated Subject Beta," the girl replied, but unlike Alpha, she tilted her head slightly as she spoke, studying Sarah's face with predatory intensity. "You are the new behavioral modification specialist." "Something like that. May I ask you some questions?" Beta nodded once, a sharp, efficient movement. "This unit will comply with examination protocols." "Do you dream?" The question seemed to catch Beta off guard. Her eyes widened fractionally, and for a moment her perfect military posture shifted. This unit does not understand the relevance of that query to behavioral modification. "I'm curious about your sleep patterns. Dreams can indicate stress or psychological irregularities." Sarah kept her voice clinical, professional. "Do you experience visual or auditory phenomena during rest periods?" Beta was quiet for a long moment, her golden eyes searching Sarah's face as if looking for a trap. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than before. "Sometimes this unit experiences sequences, images of places not contained within station parameters." "What kind of places?" "Large spaces, open air, growing things." Beta's voice grew even quieter and she looked down at her hands. "Sometimes there are others, not subjects or handlers, others who look similar to this unit." Dreams of her homeworld, Sarah realized. Despite 12 years of isolation and conditioning, Beta was still dreaming of Cathara, of forests and families she had never consciously known. The conditioning had suppressed her conscious memories, but it couldn't completely eliminate her genetic heritage or the deepest parts of her unconscious mind. "How do these sequences make you feel?" Beta's head snapped up, and for a moment her carefully controlled expression cracked entirely. Sarah saw confusion, longing, and something that might have been grief flash across her features before she reasserted control. "This unit does not experience feelings. Emotional responses compromise mission effectiveness." But she did feel. Sarah could see it clearly now. The conditioning had taught her to suppress emotional expression and to think of feelings as a weakness, but it hadn't actually eliminated her capacity for emotion. It had just driven those feelings underground, where they festered and created the behavioral anomalies that had brought Sarah to the station. The session with Gamma was the most disturbing yet. He was larger than the others, with more pronounced predatory features. His canine teeth were noticeably sharp, and his hands bore claws that could easily tear through metal. But it was his stillness that unnerved Sarah most. While Alpha stared at nothing and Beta watched with curiosity, Gamma observed her with the patient intensity of a hunter studying prey. "This unit is designated Subject Gamma," he said when she introduced herself. His voice was lower than the others, with a slight growl that seemed unconscious. "I'd like to ask you about your training," Sarah began. "This unit excels in reconnaissance and tracking," Gamma replied immediately. "Current combat efficiency rating is 96%. This unit has never failed a mission parameter." "What about the scent markings?" Gamma went very still, and Sarah could almost see his mental defenses slamming into place. According to the surveillance reports, he had been found making small scratch marks near the air vents in his cell, marks that contained trace amounts of his own scent. When confronted, he had claimed to be testing the durability of the station's construction materials. "This unit does not understand the query." "The maintenance staff found scratch marks in your cell that appear to carry your scent," Can you explain those? For the first time since Sarah had arrived at the station, she saw genuine emotion on one of the subjects' faces. Gamma's golden eyes flashed with something that might have been pain or longing, and his carefully controlled posture shifted. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than before. This unit was testing structural integrity. Station materials must be verified for security purposes. But Sarah recognized the behavior from her xenobiology training. Scent marking was a fundamental Cathara behavior, a way of claiming territory and communicating with pack members. Gamma was unconsciously trying to establish the cell as his den and to leave messages for the other subjects, despite having no conscious knowledge of why he felt compelled to do so. Do you ever feel crowded, isolated, like you need more space or different company? Gamma's breathing changed, becoming slightly faster and more shallow. His pupils dilated, and Sarah could see him fighting some internal battle between his conditioning and his instincts. This unit is optimally housed for mission parameters. This unit requires no social contact beyond operational necessity. But sometimes you make sounds during rest periods, soft vocalizations. This unit does not. Gamma stopped mid-sentence, his face going blank with shock. He hadn't realized he was making the sounds, Sarah realized. They were coming from some deep, unconscious part of his mind that remembered what it felt like to be part of a pack. The session with Delta was the most heartbreaking. She was the smallest of the four, appearing almost fragile compared to the others, but Sarah could see the coiled strength in her movements and the predatory grace that marked all Cathara. What made her different was the fear. Unlike the others, Delta couldn't quite hide her emotions behind the mask of military conditioning. When Sarah approached her cell, the girl's hands were trembling slightly, and her breathing was faster than it should have been. "Good morning," Sarah said gently. "I'm Dr. Chen." "This unit is designated Subject Delta." The response was automatic, but Delta's voice shook slightly as she spoke. "This unit is ready for examination." "Are you afraid of me?" The question seemed to hit Delta like a physical blow. She flinched backward, her golden eyes going wide, and for a moment she looked like exactly what she was, a terrified child. "This unit does not experience fear. Fear compromises combat effectiveness, and—" She stopped, pressing her lips together as if to physically prevent more words from escaping. "It's all right to be afraid," Sarah said softly. "Fear is normal, it's human." "This unit is not human," Delta whispered, and there was such pain in her voice that Sarah had to blink back tears. "This unit is a weapon. Weapons do not feel fear." "Who told you that?" "Handler Unit 7, and Handler Unit 12, and Administrative Unit 1. Delta recited the designations like a mantra, but Sarah could see her struggling against 12 years of conditioning. "This unit must be efficient. This unit must be obedient. This unit must not feel." Sarah leaned forward in her chair, speaking as gently as she could. "What if they were wrong? What if you're not just a weapon?" Delta's entire body began to shake. She wrapped her arms around herself and rocked slightly, a movement so subtle that the surveillance cameras probably wouldn't pick it up. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "If this unit is not a weapon, then what is this unit?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt the full weight of what these children had been denied. They had no concept of identity beyond their function, no understanding of personal worth or individual value. They had been deliberately isolated from everything that might have taught them about friendship, family, or love. But they were fighting back. Despite everything that had been done to them, some part of their essential nature was refusing to be completely suppressed. Alpha reached out to comfort Delta when she was isolated. Beta dreamed of forests and families. Gamma tried to mark territory and sing the wordless songs of his people. Delta drew pictures of things she had never seen but somehow remembered. Sarah spent the rest of that first day reviewing her notes and planning her approach. The official reports expected her to identify ways to suppress these emerging behaviors, to make the conditioning permanent and unbreakable. But as she sat in her quarters that night, looking out at the stars through her small porthole, she made a decision that would have terrified her supervisors. She wasn't going to suppress the behaviors. She was going to nurture them. The predator pups had been built as weapons, but they were still children. And despite 12 years of systematic abuse, they were beginning to remember what it meant to be alive, to feel, to reach out for connection with others. Sarah was going to help them remember the rest. Over the next few weeks, she began implementing what she privately called reconstruction therapy. On the surface, her sessions looked like standard psychological evaluation and behavioral modification. She asked clinical questions, took detailed notes, and filed reports that satisfied the administrator's expectations. But underneath, she was teaching them to be people again. She started small. During her session with Alpha, she began using his designation less frequently, replacing it with words like you, and eventually working toward getting him to express preferences and opinions. With Beta, she encouraged detailed descriptions of her dreams, helping her understand that the images weren't random neural firing, but memories of a heritage that belonged to her. Gamma was the most challenging because his instincts were the strongest and most threatening to the station's control systems. Sarah had to be extremely careful as she helped him understand that his need to mark territory and communicate through scent wasn't a malfunction, but a natural part of his species' behavior. And with Delta, Sarah worked on the most fundamental lesson of all, that she was not broken for feeling afraid, sad, or alone. That emotions weren't weaknesses to be eliminated but essential parts of being a conscious, living being. The work was slow, delicate, and dangerous. Sarah had to be constantly aware that every session was monitored, every interaction recorded and analyzed. She developed coded ways of communicating, using therapeutic language that had double meanings, asking questions that seemed clinical but were actually designed to help the children understand themselves better. But the most important breakthrough came at the end of her third week on the station, during a late-night emergency that would change everything. The alarm began screaming at 3:47 hours, jolting Sarah awake in her small quarters. Red emergency lights bathed everything in hellish crimson as the station's automated voice announced, "Hull breach in section, see all personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill." Sarah grabbed her emergency kit and rushed toward the containment area, her heart pounding with more than just the adrenaline of crisis. Section C was adjacent to where the children were housed. If there was structural damage, if the containment cells were compromised. She found chaos when she reached the detention level. Emergency crews rushed past her carrying repair equipment and damage assessment tools. Through the noise and confusion, she heard Administrator Vex's voice barking orders in 3 different languages. "What happened?" she called out to a passing technician. "Micrometeorite impact," the tech replied without stopping. "Punched right through the outer hull and took out half the life support systems for this section. We're evacuating non-essential areas." Sarah pushed through the crowd toward the children's cells, but found her way blocked by a Zenthari security officer whose bulk filled the entire corridor. "Restricted area, Doctor. Emergency personnel only." "I need to check on the subjects," Sarah insisted. "If there's been trauma to the containment systems, they'll need psychological evaluation." "The subjects are secured," the guard interrupted. "Standard emergency protocols are in effect." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. Standard emergency protocols for dangerous prisoners usually meant increased sedation and isolation until the crisis passed. The children would be drugged into unconsciousness and left alone in their cells while the station repaired itself around them. But as she stood there arguing with the guard, she heard something that made her blood run cold, a sound coming from the direction of the containment area that was definitely not part of standard emergency protocols. Singing. It was barely audible over the alarms and shouting, but Sarah's trained ear caught it immediately. A soft, wordless melody with the complex harmonies that marked Cathara vocal patterns. Someone was singing, and others were joining in, their voices weaving together in a way that spoke of genetic memory and deep cultural programming. The guard hadn't noticed it yet, but if he did, if any of the emergency crews realized that the subjects were engaging in prohibited species-specific behavior. "Officer, I need to speak with Administrator Vex immediately," Sarah said, putting every ounce of authority she could muster into her voice. "I have critical information about potential behavioral instabilities in the subjects that could compromise station security during the emergency." The guard's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. Behavioral instabilities in weapons-grade Cathara was exactly the kind of crisis that could turn a simple hull breach into a station-wide catastrophe. "Wait here," he ordered, and spoke rapidly into his communication device. While he was distracted, Sarah slipped past him and made her way toward the containment area. The emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the walls, and the normally sterile corridors felt alien and threatening. But the singing was getting louder, and now she could make out individual voices. Alpha's deeper tones, steady and sure like a foundation. Beta's lighter voice dancing around the melody with intricate variations. Gamma's rumbling bass, more felt than heard. And Delta's sweet, pure notes soaring above them, all like a bird in flight. They were singing together. For the first time in 12 years, the four children were behaving like what they actually were, members of a pack. A family finding comfort in each other during a time of stress and fear. Sarah reached the entrance to the containment area and found it sealed with an emergency blast door. But there was a maintenance access panel nearby, and her security clearance was still active. She keyed in her codes and slipped through the service corridor that ran behind the cells. Through the maintenance hatches, she could see into each cell. The children were pressed against the walls that separated them from each other, their hands flat against the transparent aluminum barriers. They couldn't touch, but they were as close as they could get, and their voices blended in harmonies that seemed to reach into Sarah's chest and squeeze her heart. This wasn't just singing. This was a Cathara comfort ritual, a way of reinforcing pack bonds and providing emotional support during crisis. They were doing it instinctively, without conscious knowledge of what it meant or why they felt compelled to do it. 12 years of conditioning hadn't been able to completely erase millions of years of evolution. But if the guards discovered this... Sarah moved quickly through the service corridor until she reached a point where she could access the central monitoring station for the containment area. The emergency had pulled most of the security staff away, leaving only automated systems to watch the children. She had perhaps minutes before someone came to check on them manually. Working quickly, she accessed the audio monitoring systems and began implementing a solution that would have gotten her executed for treason if anyone had caught her. Using her medical access codes, she uploaded a virus disguised as a system diagnostic that would create a feedback loop in the acoustic sensors. For the next several hours, any monitoring equipment would register only normal background noise from the cells, regardless of what the children were actually doing. Then she settled back to listen to them sing. The melody was ancient, primal, speaking to something deep in the human brain that remembered when her own ancestors had gathered around fires and found comfort in shared voices under starry skies. But there was something else in it too, something that made Sarah's throat tight with emotion. Hope. Despite everything that had been done to them, despite 12 years of isolation and conditioning and systematic abuse, these children still remembered how to find hope in each other. They were reaching across the barriers that separated them and creating something beautiful together. Sarah stayed in the service corridor for nearly an hour, listening to their voices and watching them through the maintenance hatches. Sometimes the melody would fade to whispers, and she would see them pressing their foreheads against the barriers, golden eyes closed, just breathing in each other's presence. Other times the song would swell again, filling the containment area with harmonies that transformed the sterile prison into something that felt almost like home. When the emergency crews finally finished their repairs and the station returned to normal operations, Sarah had to slip away before anyone discovered her presence. She made her way back to her quarters, officially logged the incident as a minor stress response requiring no intervention, and filed a report recommending continued standard monitoring protocols. But privately, she began planning the next phase of what she now thought of as the liberation of the predator pups. Over the following days, she started implementing changes so subtle that the monitoring systems barely registered them. During her sessions with each child, she began asking questions that seemed clinical, but were actually designed to help them understand what they had experienced during the emergency. "How did you respond to the stress of the hull breach?" she asked Alpha. "This unit maintained optimal alertness and readiness for orders," he replied, but there was something different in his voice now, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Did you notice any unusual auditory phenomena? Sometimes stress can cause sensory anomalies." Alpha's pupils dilated slightly. "This unit heard sounds, familiar sounds, but this unit has no previous experience with those specific patterns." "Describe them." "Harmonic vocalizations, multiple sources synchronized." Alpha paused, struggling with concepts he had no words for. "The sounds created a response this unit felt less alone." Sarah made careful notes. helping Alpha understand that what he had experienced wasn't a malfunction, but a natural response to connecting with others of his species. She did the same with each of the children, gradually helping them process what had happened and understand that their need for connection wasn't a weakness to be suppressed. But the real breakthrough came when she proposed a new treatment protocol to Administrator Vex. "I've identified the source of the behavioral anomalies," she reported during their weekly meeting. "The subject's conditioning is being undermined by social isolation stress. Their pack-bonding instincts are creating anxiety responses that manifest as rebellion and emotional display." Vex leaned forward with interest. "You believe increased isolation will resolve the problem?" "Actually, the opposite." Sarah kept her voice clinically neutral, hiding the racing of her heart. "I recommend controlled group sessions, limited, supervised interaction between the subjects to allow them to satisfy their pack-bonding needs without compromising their conditioning. Interaction between the weapons." Vex's four arms moved in agitation. "That could be extremely dangerous. What if they coordinate resistance efforts? What if they develop emotional attachments that compromise their obedience?" "The interactions would be completely controlled," Sarah assured him. "Clinical settings, constant monitoring, specific therapeutic protocols. We would allow just enough social contact to relieve the stress while maintaining full control over their conditioning." She had spent days crafting this proposal, knowing that she had to make it sound like a way to strengthen the children's conditioning rather than undermine it. She presented fabricated research data showing that completely isolated pack predators eventually became unstable and unreliable. She argued that controlled social contact would actually make them more effective as weapons by eliminating the psychological stress that was causing their rebellious behaviors. It took 3 more meetings and a pile of forged documentation, but eventually Vex approved a limited trial program. Beginning the following week, Sarah would be authorized to conduct group sessions with the subjects under heavy security supervision. She returned to her quarters that night feeling both triumphant and terrified. She had won the chance to let the children interact with each other for the first time in 12 years. But she had also put herself in an incredibly dangerous position. If anyone discovered what she was really trying to accomplish, it wouldn't just be her career that ended. The Council dealt harshly with those who interfered with their weapons programs. But when she thought about the harmony of those 4 voices during the emergency, when she remembered the look of desperate hope in Delta's eyes, she knew that the risk was worth it. The Predator pups had been built as weapons, but they were fighting to remember what it meant to be family. And Sarah was going to give them every opportunity to succeed, even if it cost her everything. The first group session was scheduled for the following Monday. Sarah spent the weekend preparing protocols that looked like behavioral conditioning exercises, but were actually designed to help the children learn to interact safely with each other. She practiced phrases and questions that would appear clinical to observers, but would actually guide the children toward forming the bonds they desperately needed. Sunday night, she barely slept. Tomorrow, for the first time in 12 years, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta would be in the same room together. They would be able to see each other, speak to each other, maybe even touch. Sarah had no idea what would happen when weapons-grade Cathara children were finally allowed to discover what family meant. But she was about to find out. The group session room felt like a gladiator arena designed by committee. Cold white walls, cameras positioned at every angle, and a table surrounded by chairs that were bolted to the floor. Sarah stood in the center, trying to calm her nerves as security teams made their final preparations outside. Administrator Vex's voice crackled through the intercom. "Dr. Chen, the subjects will be brought in individually. Maintain constant observation of their interactions and be prepared to terminate the session if any aggressive behaviors emerge." "Understood," Sarah replied, her mouth dry. Through the one-way observation windows, she could see a dozen species of alien researchers and security personnel watching with expressions ranging from scientific curiosity to barely concealed fear. The first door opened, and Alpha entered the room. He moved with the same mechanical precision she had grown accustomed to during their individual sessions, but Sarah noticed immediately that something was different. His nostrils flared slightly as he scanned the room, and his golden eyes were more alert than usual. He could smell the others. They were close, closer than they had been in 12 years. "Subject Alpha reporting for group behavioral assessment," he announced, standing at perfect attention beside his designated chair. "Please be seated," Sarah said gently. "We'll wait for the others." Alpha sat with military precision, but Sarah caught him glancing toward the doors with an expression that might have been anticipation. His hands, normally folded calmly in his lap, tapped a subtle rhythm against his legs, the same rhythm she had heard during their emergency singing. The second door opened, and Beta entered. The change in her was immediate and dramatic. Her usual predatory alertness sharpened to laser focus the moment she saw Alpha, and her carefully controlled breathing became rapid and shallow. For 12 years, she had known that others like her existed, but she had never actually seen them. "Subject Beta reporting," she said, but her voice lacked its usual mechanical precision. She couldn't stop staring at Alpha, her golden eyes wide with something that looked like wonder. Alpha turned his head to look at her, and for a moment both children forgot their conditioning entirely. Their gazes locked, and Sarah watched recognition pass between them, not just awareness of each other's presence, but a deeper recognition of kinship, of shared experience, of finally not being alone. "Please take a seat, Beta," Sarah said softly, trying to keep her own voice steady. Beta moved to her chair without breaking eye contact with Alpha. As she sat down, she positioned herself so she could continue watching him, and Sarah noticed that both children had unconsciously synchronized their breathing. Gamma entered next, and the dynamic in the room shifted immediately. He was larger than the others, more obviously predatory, and his enhanced senses meant he was receiving far more information than his siblings. He paused in the doorway, his head tilted slightly as he processed the scents and sounds of his packmates. "Subject Gamma," he began, but stopped mid-sentence. His gaze moved from Alpha to Beta, and Sarah watched his conditioning crack in real time. These weren't just other subjects or potential threats or mission parameters. They were his people. The sound that emerged from Gamma's throat wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a growl. It was something deeper, more primal, a vocalization that spoke directly to genetic memories of pack greetings and family reunions. Alpha and Beta both turned toward him, and Sarah saw their pupils dilate with recognition. Before any of them could fully process what was happening, the final door opened, and Delta stepped into the room. She was the smallest, the youngest, the most obviously fragile. But the moment she saw the others, her entire posture changed. The fear that had marked all of Sarah's sessions with her melted away, replaced by an expression of pure joy that transformed her face. "Oh," she whispered, and that single word carried 12 years of loneliness and the overwhelming relief of finally not being alone anymore. For a moment, all 4 children just looked at each other. 12 years of conditioning battled against millions of years of evolution, and Sarah could see the war being fought behind their golden eyes. They had been trained to think of themselves as individual weapons, but their genetics screamed that they were family. Evolution 1. Alpha stood first, his movement triggering an instant response from the others. They rose together, drawn by instincts older than civilization, and began moving toward each other with the careful intensity of wild animals testing the boundaries of a new situation. "Please remain seated," Sarah said, knowing she had to maintain the pretense of control for the observers. "This is a supervised interaction exercise." But the children weren't listening to her anymore. They were listening to something far older and more powerful than human authority. They formed a loose circle in the center of the room, each maintaining careful distance but clearly yearning to be closer. Sarah could see their nostrils flaring as they learned each other's sense, their heads tilting as they processed vocalizations too subtle for human ears. "State your designations for the record," Sarah said, trying to maintain some semblance of clinical procedure. "Subject Alpha," the eldest said, but his voice was softer now, warmer. "Subject Beta," she replied, and Sarah caught her reaching one hand slightly toward Gamma before stopping herself. "Subject Gamma," he rumbled, and the sound was different, now richer, with undertones that spoke to pack dynamics and protective instincts. "Subject Delta," the youngest whispered, and her voice was steady for the first time since Sarah had met her. They stood there for several minutes, just breathing in each other's presence, and Sarah realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. These children had been systematically isolated and abused for 12 years, but the moment they were reunited, their natural pack bonds began reasserting themselves with overwhelming force. "How do you feel about this interaction?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice clinical for the observers while giving the children permission to express themselves. This unit experiences recognition, Alpha said slowly, struggling to find words for emotions he had been trained not to acknowledge. The presence of similar units creates a response that improves overall system stability. Familiar, Beta added, her eyes never leaving the others. Like remembering something that was forgotten. Safe, Gamma said, and the word came out like a growl of contentment. This unit feels protected and protective. All eyes turned to Delta, the smallest and youngest. She looked around at the others, her golden eyes bright with unshed tears, and when she spoke, her voice carried a truth that cut through all their conditioning. Home, she whispered, this feels like home. The word hung in the air like a prayer, and Sarah watched as all 4 children absorbed its meaning. Home wasn't a place, it was each other. After 12 years of believing they were weapons designed for isolation and violence, they were remembering what it felt like to belong somewhere to someone. Administrator Vex's voice crackled through the intercom, tight with concern. Dr. Chen, the subjects appear to be exhibiting heightened emotional responses. Perhaps we should terminate this session. The emotional responses are exactly what we want to observe, Sarah replied quickly. This is crucial data for understanding how to prevent future behavioral anomalies. I recommend we continue monitoring. But even as she spoke, she could see that the children were struggling with the conflict between their conditioning and their instincts. They wanted to move closer to each other, but 12 years of training held them back. They wanted to touch, to provide comfort, to engage in the physical bonding behaviors that were natural to their species. I want to try a simple exercise, Sarah announced. Alpha, please approach Delta and assess her current stress levels. It was a perfectly reasonable clinical request that gave Alpha permission to get closer to his youngest packmate. He moved toward Delta with careful steps, his enhanced senses analyzing her condition. But when he reached her, something deeper took over. Delta was trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the intensity of finally being near her family. Without conscious thought, Alpha reached out and placed his hand gently on her shoulder, the first voluntary physical contact between any of them in 12 years. The effect was electric. Delta's trembling stopped immediately, and she leaned into the touch with a soft sound of contentment. Beta and Gamma moved closer, drawn by instincts they didn't understand but couldn't resist. Within moments, they had formed a loose huddle, not quite touching, but close enough to share warmth and scent and the fundamental comfort of pack presence. Their breathing synchronized, their postures relaxed, and for the first time since Sarah had met them, they looked like what they really were, children who had found their family. Fascinating, Sarah said for the benefit of the observers, making notes on her tablet. The stress indicators are decreasing significantly. The social contact appears to be providing the stabilizing effect we theorized. What she didn't say was that she was watching 4 broken children begin to heal simply by being in each other's presence. The fear in Delta's eyes was fading. The mechanical precision of Alpha's movements was softening. Beta's predatory alertness was relaxing into warm awareness. And Gamma's isolation-induced aggression was transforming into protective tenderness toward his younger packmates. They spent the remaining hour of the session engaged in what looked like clinical exercises, but were actually carefully designed opportunities for bonding. Sarah had them work together on simple problem-solving tasks, coordinate their movements in basic patterns, and communicate through verbal and non-verbal cues. But the real communication was happening on levels that human observers couldn't detect. Subtle scent marking, micro-expressions that carried pack hierarchy information, shared glances that established trust and affection. They were rapidly forming the family bonds that should have developed naturally in their earliest years. When the session ended and they had to return to their individual cells, Sarah watched their hearts break in real time. They moved apart slowly, reluctantly, each step away from the others clearly causing them pain. Same time tomorrow, she announced, and saw hope flicker in all 4 pairs of golden eyes. That night, Sarah filed a report describing the session as a successful initial step in stress reduction therapy. She recommended continued group sessions to allow for proper behavioral stabilization, and included fabricated data showing improved compliance and reduced aggressive indicators. But privately, she was planning something much more ambitious. The children had rediscovered what family meant, but they were still trapped in individual cells, still subjected to daily conditioning, still being trained as weapons. It was time to take the next step. Sarah began researching the station's security protocols, maintenance schedules, and emergency procedures. She started identifying potential allies among the station staff, people who might be willing to help if they understood what was really happening to the children. Most importantly, she began planning an escape route. The Predator pups had been built as weapons, but in rediscovering their family bonds, they had also rediscovered their strength. Sarah was going to help them use that strength to break free from their prison and find a place where they could grow up as they were meant to together, protected and loved. But first, she had to make sure that when the time came to run, they would be ready to run as one. 3 months after the first group session, Sarah stood in her quarters staring at a message that changed everything. The holographic display showed Administrator Vex's face, his expression carrying the cold satisfaction of someone delivering unwelcome news. Dr. Chen, the Council has reviewed your progress reports on the subjects. While the group sessions have shown promise in reducing behavioral anomalies, they have decided to accelerate the timeline. The subjects will be separated next week for deployment to different sectors. Each will be assigned to a Council fleet as an individual weapon unit. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Separation meant the destruction of everything they had built together. Worse, deployment meant the children would be used for their intended purpose, as living weapons in the Council's expansion wars, killing and dying for the same organization that had destroyed their homeworld and murdered their families. The final conditioning protocols begin tomorrow, Vex continued. Deep neural restructuring to eliminate any remaining emotional capacity and ensure absolute obedience. Your group sessions have served their purpose in stabilizing the subjects for this procedure. The message ended, leaving Sarah alone with the crushing realization that she had run out of time. All her careful planning, all her subtle preparations, none of it would matter if the children underwent neural restructuring. The procedure would permanently destroy their capacity for independent thought and emotional connection. They would become true weapons, incapable of rebellion, resistance, or love. Sarah activated her secure communication device and sent a coded message to Dr. Marcus Webb on the cargo station in the Tau Ceti system. Marcus had been her mentor during her residency, and more importantly, he was part of an underground network that helped refugees escape from Council persecution. If anyone could arrange extraction for 4 dangerous children and a rogue psychologist, it would be him. His response came within hours. Pickup possible at coordinates you specify. Window opens in 72 hours, closes in 96. Transport limited. Suggest minimal baggage. 72 hours. Sarah looked at the time display and began calculating. The neural restructuring was scheduled to begin in 18 hours, which meant she had to move tonight. She spent the next few hours implementing the plan she had hoped never to use. Working through the station's maintenance network, she began uploading viruses disguised as routine system updates. Power grid controls, security cameras, door locks, life support systems, everything that would need to malfunction simultaneously to create enough chaos for an escape. At 2200 hours, during the night shift when security was lightest, Sarah made her way to the containment area. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she used her access codes one last time, knowing that every step she took was being recorded by systems she couldn't disable without triggering immediate alerts. The children were awake when she reached their cells, all 4 of them sitting in identical positions of alert readiness. They had sensed something was different, the change in her scent, the tension in her movements, the adrenaline that no amount of training could completely hide. Emergency relocation protocol, she announced to the monitoring systems, hopping her voice sounded calm and official. Subjects are being transferred to secure conditioning facility for neural restructuring preparation. She opened Alpha's cell first. He stepped out with military precision, but she caught the way his nostrils flared as he processed her scent and the changes in the station's normal patterns. When their eyes met, she saw understanding there. He knew something significant was about to happen. Beta emerged from her cell with predatory awareness heightened to maximum sensitivity. Her golden eyes swept the corridor, cataloging every detail, every potential threat or opportunity. When she looked at Sarah, her head tilted slightly in a gesture that could have been curiosity or recognition. Gamma's response was more dramatic. The moment his cell opened, His enhanced senses detected the stress hormones and adrenaline that marked Sarah's emotional state. He moved toward her with protective instincts clearly activated, positioning himself between her and the corridor that led back to the security stations. Delta was last, smallest, and youngest, but somehow understanding the situation most clearly. She looked at Sarah with eyes that were no longer clouded by fear or confusion, but bright with hope and determination. When she stepped out of her cell, she moved directly to the others, forming the tight pack formation they had developed during their group sessions. "Follow standard escort protocols," Sarah said for the monitors, but her eyes communicated something entirely different to the children. She led them through corridors she had memorized during months of careful observation, taking a route that avoided the main security checkpoints. They were halfway to the shuttle bay when the first alarms began to sound. Sarah had programmed her viruses to trigger simultaneously, but she hadn't counted on the station's adaptive security systems. Emergency protocols activated immediately, sealing blast doors and flooding the corridors with armed security teams. "Run," Sarah whispered, and the word released 12 years of suppressed instincts. The children exploded into motion with inhuman speed and grace. Alpha took point, his enhanced reflexes identifying threats and obstacles before they became dangerous. Beta and Gamma flanked Sarah, their predatory senses turned to maximum sensitivity. Delta, despite being the smallest, moved with fluid precision that made her nearly invisible in the chaotic lighting of the emergency systems. They encountered their first security team at Junction 7 Alpha. 3 Xanthari guards with energy weapons and combat armor, positioned to block the only route to the shuttle bay. Sarah's heart sank as she realized they would have to surrender or. The children attacked as one coordinated unit. Alpha went low, using his enhanced strength to tackle the first guard and send him crashing into the wall with enough force to crack the metal plating. Beta moved like liquid shadow, somehow getting behind the second guard and applying pressure to neural points that dropped him unconscious in seconds. Gamma's enhanced senses allowed him to predict the third guard's movements, and he disarmed the alien with almost casual efficiency. The entire encounter lasted less than 15 seconds. Sarah stared in shock at the unconscious guards, then at the 4 children who had moved with lethal precision to protect her. They looked back at her with expressions that were no longer emotionally vacant, but filled with fierce determination and protective instinct. "We protect Pack," Gamma said simply, his voice carrying the weight of genetic programming that no amount of conditioning could overcome. "You are Pack now." They continued through the station, encountering security teams at 3 more checkpoints. Each time, the children eliminated the threats with coordinated efficiency that was both terrifying and beautiful to watch. But they were careful to use non-lethal force, somehow understanding that killing was not necessary to achieve their goal. Sarah realized they were holding back. These children, trained from birth to be perfect weapons, were restraining themselves because they understood that she wouldn't approve of unnecessary killing. They had learned to moderate their deadliest instincts out of consideration for her moral standards. They reached the shuttle bay as the station's main power grid finally began to fail. Sarah's viruses had done their work, creating cascading system failures that would take hours to repair. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the walls as they approached the maintenance shuttle Sarah had prepared. "Dr. Chen," Administrator Vex's voice echoed from the entrance behind them, amplified by a portable speaker system. "Step away from the weapons and return to your quarters. This foolish escape attempt ends now." Sarah turned to see Vex approaching with a full squad of battle-armored security troops. Energy weapons were trained on her and the children, and she realized with sinking heart that there was no way 4 unarmed children, no matter how enhanced, could fight their way through that much firepower. But Alpha stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and the weapons, and spoke with a voice that carried 12 years of suppressed rage and newfound purpose. "We are not weapons," he said, his words cutting through the chaos like a blade. "We are family, and no one separates family." The other 3 children moved to stand beside him, forming a protective line in front of Sarah. Their posture was unmistakably defensive, but there was something else in their stance that made even the heavily armed security troops hesitate. Dignity. For the first time in their lives, these children stood not as cowering prisoners or emotionless tools, but as beings with inherent worth, and the right to protect what they loved. "You are military assets of the Galactic Council," Vex replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "You will return to your cells immediately." "No," Beta said quietly. "We choose our own path now." "We choose each other," Gamma added, his voice a protective rumble. "We choose freedom," Delta whispered, but her voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she watched these 4 children, who had been broken and rebuilt as weapons, make the conscious choice to reclaim their humanity. They knew the odds against them, knew the firepower arrayed against them, but they chose to stand together regardless. That was when the lights went out. Sarah's final virus had triggered the station's complete power failure, plunging everything into absolute darkness. But Cathara eyes were adapted for low-light hunting, and their enhanced senses gave them significant advantages in blackout conditions. "Move," Sarah shouted, and they raced toward the shuttle as chaos erupted behind them. Energy weapons fired blindly in the darkness, their discharge illuminating confused guards stumbling into each other and calling out contradictory orders. But the children moved through the darkness like ghosts, their natural abilities finally unleashed from 12 years of suppression. They reached the shuttle as emergency power began to restore minimal lighting. Sarah activated the launch sequence while the children secured themselves in passenger seats designed for much larger beings. The shuttle's engines came online just as security teams reached the bay entrance. "Hold on," Sarah called out, and engaged the emergency launch protocol that would blast them clear of the station in seconds. The acceleration pressed them all back into their seats as the shuttle raced away from Omega-7. Through the viewport, Sarah could see the research station falling behind them, its emergency lights creating a constellation of failure and confusion in the darkness. They had done it. After 12 years of imprisonment, conditioning, and abuse, the Predator pups were free. But freedom was just the beginning. Over the next several hours, as Sarah piloted the shuttle toward the rendezvous coordinates Marcus had provided, she watched the children begin to truly understand what had happened to them. Away from the station's surveillance and conditioning systems, their natural personalities began to emerge more clearly. Alpha revealed himself to be a natural leader, but one who led through earned respect rather than imposed authority. Beta showed a curiosity about the universe that 12 years of isolation hadn't been able to destroy. Gamma's protective instincts extended not just to his packmates, but to Sarah, whom he had apparently adopted as family. And Delta, freed from constant fear, began to display a joy in simple experiences that transformed her entire demeanor. They asked questions about the stars they could see through the viewport, about the planets they were passing, about what would happen to them now. Sarah answered as honestly as she could, explaining that their future was uncertain, but that they would face it together. The rendezvous with Marcus's ship went smoothly. His crew, experienced in handling dangerous refugees, accepted the 4 enhanced children with professional calm and quickly integrated them into the ship's temporary living arrangements. As Sarah watched Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta explore their new environment with wonder and caution, she realized that her work with them was far from over. They had escaped their physical prison, but they still carried psychological scars that would take years to heal. They had rediscovered family, but they still needed to learn what that meant beyond survival and protection. Most importantly, they needed to decide who they wanted to become now that they were free to choose their own identities. Sarah had helped them remember what family meant, but now she would help them discover what it meant to live as a family in a universe that might fear them, but could never again control them. The Predator pups had been built as weapons, but they had chosen to become something far more dangerous to their former captors, free beings who understood the value of love, loyalty, and choice. And together, they would build a future worthy of the family they had become.